Thank you to David for organizing, and the team for organizing this important conference and for inviting me to this keynote lecture. I'm really honored to be here and very happy. And in my talk that I want to give today, and I don't have the title on my paper indeed, but I want to discuss strange connections, alliances between intersectional feminism and anti-Semitism. So that's more or less the topic. And why do I call these connections, these alliances strange? It's because I understand feminism as intrinsically emancipatory in its basic understanding, whereas anti-Semitism is the epitome of anti-emancipatory reaction and rebellion. So the question is, how do these two things come together, these two moments come together? And it will turn out that on the one hand, those intersectional feminisms that I criticize here understand something different by emancipation than is usual in a left tradition from Hegel via Marx to the critical theory of the Frankfurt School. That these currents of feminism understand the concept of emancipation as intrinsically Western and thus questionable in regard of the so-called Global South. And on the other hand, that these same intersectional feminist currents often do not even recognize anti-Semitism, or sometimes even attribute an oppositional force against global elites and against imperialism and exploitation to it. So I take my starting point from certain constrictions of intersectional feminism and briefly go into the current problematics of how certain intersectional feminisms exclude Jews and how they exclude the critique of global anti-Semitism. And then in a second step, I want to offer an interpretation of these processes. And finally, I will also propose a different view on intersectionality in what I call the intersectionality of ideologies, a view that helps indeed better understand anti-Semitism. So let me start with intersectionality and its theoretical and practical pitfalls. The concept of intersectionality, as most of you probably know, has steadily gained influence within the last decades, particularly since the 1990s, and it functions as a basis for global solidarity in many Western feminist and anti-racist movements and organizations. Its basic assumption is that feminists ought not turn a blind eye to other forms of oppression. So, an intersectional view recognizes that in modern society, different forms of oppression and discrimination occur simultaneously rather than separately, and that they are mutually entangled. Not so obvious, however, is which forms of oppression find entry into the intersectionality framework. Most often, the spectrum is tied back to the classical triad of race, class, and gender, and more recently also age, ability, or religion, whereas anti-Semitism is rarely considered. One reason for such omission is that anti-Semitism is often simply subsumed under racism, which hides the specificity of anti-Semitic ideology and thus makes contemporary anti-Semitism increasingly undetectable. And in addition to this, however, an anti-Zionist political agenda becomes also effective here. So I would say that many intersectional feminists, not all of them of course, many, see themselves in opposition to what they call white feminism, and consequently they declare Palestine is a feminist issue. And this implies that Palestinians are considered POC and Israelis white, which is itself already problematic. But in addition to this, the feminist solidarity with Palestine is quite one-sided in that it is exclusively directed against Israel. Anti-feminist and homophobic structures within Palestinian society are hardly addressed. For example, in May 2021, 250 women's studies programs, and other organizations in the US and Canada endorsed a call by the US-based Palestine Feminist Collective for, I quote, the decolonization and liberation of Palestine, end of quote. And in this call, the homophobic and anti-feminist tyranny of Hamas and Fatah was not mentioned at all. This is just one example. Another example is the famous philosopher and political activist Angela Davis, former member of the Communist Party and activist of Black feminism, who is today one of the most prominent activists of BDS and who views the Palestinian struggle against Israel intersectionally related to the struggle of Black Americans against a racist system in the USA. So, consequently, she views Zionism as a racist ideology. And yet another example for what I'm talking about here was the old leadership of Women's March on Washington, Linda Sarsour, for example, who, besides advocating Sharia law, claimed that a feminist cannot possibly be a Zionist and vice versa. In part, I would say such incidents result from manifest anti-Semitism on the part of activists who mask anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism as opposition to colonialism and imperialism. But I think that the problem that intersectionality has with anti-Semitism goes even deeper. It is due to a certain understanding of intersectionality that already conceptually largely excludes the cognition of anti-Semitism. In general, intersectionality responds to the interlocking of race, class, and gender as axes of discrimination and domination. Now, anti-Semitism does not really fit into the category of race, since it differs in significant ways from racism, even though it also operates with racist moments, of course. But unlike most racisms, anti-Semitism operates essentially through conspiracy narratives that ascribe to Jews a secret power, excessive influence in media, economics, and international politics, and condemn Israel as an illegitimate state. These attributions do not fit into the intersectional triad of race, class, and gender by which the oppressed of the world are meant. To the contrary, in anti-Semitism, specifically in the one related to Israel, Jews are not seen as oppressed and persecuted, but as oppressors and persecutors themselves. And some intersectional feminists adopt this view, which implies an anti-Semitic victim-perpetrator reversal that deliberately ignores that the modern nation-state Israel is also a reaction to massive global anti-Semitism. On the ideological level, however, the victim-perpetrator reversal becomes clear when Jewishness and whiteness, Zionism and white supremacy are merged. Then, no longer are unnamed and unquestioned power structures revealed in which white people tend to have more resources, better opportunities, more influence, and more security. But rather, familiar anti-Semitic stereotypes of alleged Jewish conspiracy are confirmed, that Jews control media, international politics, and the global economy, and that the State of Israel is the spearhead of Western imperialism in the Middle East. Jews appear then as the super whites, or the super colonizers, with which it is easy to eliminate the concern about global anti-Semitism from the anti-racist intersectional agenda. So here we see that the distinction between racism and anti-Semitism should not be drawn too strictly either, because otherwise the commonalities get lost from view and anti-Semitism even more falls outside the intersectional framework of analysis. Jews then are not recognized as a minority that has been racially persecuted for centuries. Instead, the image is reversed. They appear as a white elite and Zionism as a racist ideology. On such a distorted ideological basis, anti-Semitism then can even appear as oppositional and impeccably anti-imperialist. And this tendency is manifest in the strange alliance between intersectional feminist and queer movements on the one hand and BDS on the other hand, in what is called queer BDS. In this alliance, anti-Zionism becomes more important than the struggle against homophobia and against anti-feminism. Indeed, anti-homophobia, when directed against Arab communities, happens to be labeled racist and anti-Muslim. This is particularly evident in the accusation of pinkwashing. So I would say that we can observe a profound anti-queerness in queer BDS, in, for example, what Angela Davis says, who repeatedly pointed out that queer BDS was not about Palestinians' individual rights of sexual self-determination within their respective cultural or religious communities. She pointed out that queer BDS was solely about uncovering the purported, I quote, contemptuousness behind Israel's pro-gay image, end of quote. And in the same vein, the US-based post-colonial writer Jaspia Puer says, I quote, Palestinian queers for BDS members point out that it is irrelevant whether Palestinian society is homophobic or not, end of quote. So we see that queer Palestinians are turned into abstract images, into tokens in an anti-Zionist activism, or into bodies, as they are called in this jargon. Hence, the slogan that Palestine is a feminist issue is not about the fight for individual rights to sexual self-determination, but it is about the fight for the national self-determination of Palestine as such, whereas hardly any critical thought is spent on the obvious question on how a future Palestinian nation state would treat its female and LGBTIQ citizens, and what the position of the Palestinian Authority, Islamic Jihad, and Hamas is toward gender equality and sexual self-determination. The premise is the sovereignty of the Palestinian nation. But as Max Horkheimer once wrote, the sovereignty of a nation is something different from the freedom of those who live in it, end of quote. In this situation, we can observe that some Western post-colonial star writers, like Joseph Massad or Jaspia Puer, starting from a comparatively secure Western position regarding their own rights to sexual self-determination, they claim that scrutinizing Arab and Palestinian homophobia would impose on the Muslim other homonormative and homo-nationalist principles. The so-called gay international, they say, would produce gays and lesbians where they would not exist. In this perspective, then, homosexuality as a sexual identity with demands to self-determination and individual rights is something alien to the Muslim and Arab culture. To build an identity of homosexuality is considered Western and thus non-Islamic. Eventually, gay rights themselves are considered Western and alien, and yet hostile to the Muslim world, and their introduction in the Arab world and countries a neo-colonialist act. Similarly, the Palestinian activist Hainin Maiki considers the women's rights discourse, I quote, anti-revolutionary, as it relies too much on notions of tolerance, equality, and normality, end of quote. But even if we criticize the notion of normality, and even if we criticize the unequal distribution of rights, we cannot not want rights. The post-colonial charge against the so-called gay international and Israel is that in a new imperialism and colonialism, the white, queer or gay wants to save the brown, queer or gay from the brown homophobic man. And this criticism of homonationalism wants to rescue the idea of an authentic Arabic sexuality from Westernization. But in fact, the image of a pure, non-Western Arab sexuality is itself a Western neo-Orientalism and a projection screen for Western longings for authenticity. A supposedly authentic Arabic sexuality is turned against the purportedly artificial and individualistic gay and queer sexuality in Israel. Thus, the Arab authenticity is needed to fight off Israeli artificiality. And this is a well-known anti-Semitic dichotomy, and itself an entirely Western view that is hardly compatible with the struggle of queer Palestinians who see themselves stripped of the possibility to be whoever they want to be and of demanding the protection of their individual rights. They see themselves confronted with the demand to remain authentically Arab. Demanding queer rights, they are told, would be treason against the common Palestinian cause. Even Samira Saraya from the Palestinian queer feminist group Aswat criticizes this as an abuse, I quote, abuse of the occupation as an excuse for not supporting the LGBTQ fight. To me, this kind of argument functions so as to delegitimize our struggle as Palestinian LGBTQ, not really to save any authentic sexuality. It harms our struggle against homophobia. Like other activists, also she cannot be blamed of being one-sided pro-Israel, rather the opposite. But like her, many Palestinian queers insist that Muslim homophobia is not only an attribution of the West, but also a means used by the non-West to distinguish itself from the West. Thus, Arab LGBTQ activists see themselves threatened in Israel by the Islamic movement, which described the group Aswat, from which Samira Saraya is. They describe this group as, I quote, a fatal cancer that should be forbidden from spreading and from eliminating the Arab culture, end of quote. So, notwithstanding these facts and notwithstanding the criticisms from the part of queer Palestinians, queer BDS is one of the loudest forms of current international queer and intersectional discourses and regularly hijacks intersectional social movements all over the world for its anti-Semitic agenda. And in the light of such political misuse, many anti-Semitism researchers today view intersectionality as an essentially political slogan that should not be used anymore. But I argue, in contrast to this, for a critical reclaiming of the idea. And with this, I come to my last point. I think it is necessary to develop an understanding of intersectionality that not only avoids the pitfalls regarding anti-Semitism, but that turns intersectionality itself into a tool to analyze and criticize anti-Semitism. Why? Because, in my view, anti-Semitism's structure is itself intersectional. And let me go a little bit into detail here. The early critical theory of the Frankfurt School, particularly connected to the names Theodor Adorno and Else Frenkel-Brunswick, they developed a critique of anti-Semitism that viewed anti-Semitism, nationalism, racism, and sexism as intertwining ideologies. The broad empirical studies, the authoritarian personality conducted in the 1940s in the United States with the aim of surveying the authoritarian fascist political potential across the American population, these studies concluded that ideologies rarely occur isolated from each other, but develop within a broader framework. And this broader framework they called the authoritarian ideological attitudinal syndrome. And within this larger framework, ideologies mutually overlap and strengthen one another, taking on a specific interblending form from which they derive their tough and flexible effectiveness. Following this seminal insight, ideologies are indeed intersectional. They intertwine and reinforce each other, constantly reforming and reactivating themselves in this process. How does anti-Semitism operate with sexist, racist, and nationalist moments? How do anti-Semitic motives shine through in anti-feminism? How does nationalism or anti-genderism mask latent anti-Semitism? Along such questions, I developed the concept of intersectionality of ideologies. And I want to give you an example for what I mean with an intersectional ideology critique that is necessary for an adequate understanding of anti-Semitism. You may have come across the anti-Semitism scandal at the Documenta exhibition in Kassel, Germany this year. Several paintings and videos showed clearly anti-Semitic content. One of them was entitled People's Justice by the Indonesian collective Taring Padi, showing on the one side, it's a huge banner, showing on the one side the decadent Western colonialist modernity, and on the other side, the authentic world of the oppressed peoples. So this is itself already a purely Manichaean worldview, good here, evil there, which is central to anti-Semitism. And consequently, on the evil side, there are openly anti-Semitic depictions of Jews, in particular a figure with bloodshot eyes, a hooked nose, vampire fangs, thick glasses, and temple curls. And on his bowler head, the double rune sign of the SS can be seen. The figure is in the center of the painting, which in general operates with massive sexual fantasies of submission, permissiveness, and decadence. So the anti-Semitism in this picture was broadly discussed and criticized in public. But it was striking how little the discussion has illuminated the sexism that is also operative in that image. Next to the anti-Semitic figure, the evil, sexual, devouring woman appears bare-breasted with her tongue hanging out lustfully, and she's carrying a full shopping cart. The picture displays that, yes, it is, well, also funny, you are right. The picture displays the importance of sexuality regimes for anti-Semitism and anti-feminism alike. A sexuality that is oriented towards lust, a free sexuality, is considered evil and abominable, as hoard out and directly linked to money and consumerism. The lustful woman, thereby, seems to be guided by the Jew as bloodsucker and seducer. So the money Jew, the figure of the money Jew, and the figure of the sexual woman, both figures stand for decadent greed and lechery, alienated from nature. On the other side of the picture, however, which symbolizes the oppressed but authentic peoples, there is no sexualized nudity, yet no sexuality at all. We see that the anti-Semitism in this particular picture not only works via clearly anti-Semitic images, but via the whole imaginary of a lustful sexuality, of consumerism, modernity, and emancipation, all secretly controlled and directed by the Jews. To realize this, it is necessary to view anti-Semitism in connection with anti-feminism and sexism. Thus, it is necessary to develop an intersectional view on ideologies. And then we see that anti-Semitism stands out as a thoroughly intersectional ideology, in the sense that it integrates and operates through moments that may not in themselves appear anti-Semitic, but sexist, homophobic, racist, nationalist, and so on. The connection of anti-Semitism and anti-feminism is old, as we know. Already in the 19th century, women's emancipation was considered a Jewish conspiracy against the national unity. With money and ruse, Jews would seduce non-Jewish women to emancipate themselves from heteronormative gender roles. Thus, in anti-Semitism, we find innumerable images insinuating that Jews undermine the ruling heteronormative order. This connection, still today, is fixed part in right-wing, Islamist, and leftist anti-Semitism. Understanding anti-Semitism as an intersectional ideology means to understand that anti-Semitism integrates these other forms of ideologies, and on top of it all, it provides a completely distorted and delusional view of class antagonism. It often masks itself as a critique of capitalism and imperialism, and identifies Jews with capitalism and imperialism. And via this multi-layered fusion with other ideologies, anti-Semitism achieves the feature of a comprehensive worldview, of a solidified worldview that indeed serves as an integrating ideology across opposing political spheres. It is common to rightists, Islamists, culturalists, leftists, feminists, queer activists, and so on. Therefore, I propose a new view on intersectionality, an intersectionality of ideologies. I think we need to constantly point out these ideological intersections in order to prevent the current trend of fragmentation, desolidarization, and repressive particularism. We need to reopen the perspective and recognize that critical potential of intersectionality, the critical potential of intersectionality as a framework for analyzing the larger context of our society, a framework that recognizes how ideologies and inequalities are in fact and indeed interwoven in order to break through the narrowness of selective empathy and restrictive identity politics. So an intersectional analysis of ideology, in addition, can also advance the practice of coalition building, so that in left global struggle, anti-racism and the struggle against anti-Semitism are no longer seen as opposites, but recognized as a common struggle. And for this to happen, however, it is necessary to address and criticize the sometimes latent, sometimes quite overt anti-Semitism in some intersectional contexts. So, my last sentence, to sum up. The critique of intersectionality presented here in this talk is intended as a feminist rescue operation aimed at making the approach available for a feminist dialectical theory and for an emancipatory practice that does not exclude Jews and that is mindful of global anti-Semitism, sexism, and racism. From this point of view, intersectionality can be seen as an attempt to experience and think particularity and pluralism while being mindful of universality in the sense of connecting and shared interests. I thank you very much for your attention.